Hello guys, welcome to Cook With Me Live. Thank you so much for being on tonight. I am very excited to be in the kitchen with you tonight. Those of you that are watching this for the very first time, welcome. I know we have quite a few of you online tonight from the 28-day challenge from the Whole Food Collective. So thank you and welcome, a very warm welcome. This is Cook With Me Live, and those of you that are regulars here on Cook With Me Live, please help everyone else feel welcome and give us a little hello. Please let me know if you're in the kitchen tonight, if you're cooking with me, or if you're just watching, and then maybe who else is in the kitchen with you. If you've got some little ones or some teenagers watching along, would love to hear about that too, so we can hopefully help make this a little bit more engaging and also answer your questions as we go. So even if you're not cooking the recipe along with me tonight, then you can still be asking your questions to get clarity. If there's anything that's not completely crystal clear for you, please feel free to ask those questions. That is the whole reason why I go to the effort of doing this live, is so that I can answer it on the fly as you ask those questions. So please feel free, there's no such thing as a dumb question, and probably chances are if you're thinking it, someone else is too. So what are we making tonight? Tonight is Jazzy Cake, and this is kind of a shorter name rather than saying sweet potato chocolate cake. I wanted to call it Jazzy Cake in honor of the person who initially kind of introduced me to the idea. Now, granted, I have taken a definite Ashley spin on this recipe, but the initial cake that I tried was from Jasmine. So hello, Jasmine, if you're watching tonight, and thank you so much for the inspiration for this recipe. She made me the most amazing sweet potato chocolate cake. And I guess the adaptation that I've taken on it is to make it a little bit more economical, a little bit more accessible for most families. Granted, I have technically increased the number of ingredients. I've also tried to increase the amount of fiber and a few little things like that. But overall, thank you so much, Jasmine, for the inspiration on this recipe, and I hope you guys are going to love this just, I guess, as much as a regular chocolate cake for your family. And Jasmine, I hope you're going to feel that I've done this recipe justice, so thank you again. Jasmine is one of my fellow pantry flippers, so she is my Batman to Robin kind of thing in when we go in and help everyone in their home, in their pantry, to flip their pantry from more processed foods to whole foods, as well as rearrange and organize the rest of the kitchen so it's a heap more functional and a lot easier to use. So those are very massive days, and I could not do it without my wonderful helpers. So thank you, Jasmine, for being one of those. All right, so welcome. We've got Glenda online so far, and Jody. Thank you so much, Glenda. So good seeing you today. Glenda's one of my KRP, which stands for the Kitchen Reset Program, recent graduates. So we had a good catch up today. Thank you, Glenda, for being online. Jody, hello. You're cooking with me for the first time. Well, welcome and thank you. Please feel free to stop and ask those questions if you need to along the way. Tina, welcome. Hello. Thank you. Yeah, all right, so we're gonna jump straight in, guys. This is gonna be a fairly quick one, simply because the cake needs to cook for about 25 to 30 minutes in the oven, and rather than just talk your ear off for that long, I've actually made one in advance so that I can show you the full process in a bit of a shorter time period, cutting out that baking stage. If we were doing more of a savory meal, I would take that opportunity to kind of show you how I work in the kitchen to do other things while we're making that meal in and of itself. Because this is a bit more of a dessert, I'm gonna kind of skip that step and let you guys go back to your dinner a little bit earlier tonight. So the one thing that we do have to have done in advance for this recipe is going to be the baking of the sweet potato. You technically can do this with raw sweet potato. So you could just be grating your sweet potato to get the same volume. Actually, weight would be more accurate. So the 500 gram weight is more accurate than volume, by the way. So you could be using raw sweet potato. The only difference is potentially going to come back to texture and sweetness. So definitely doable, okay? But you're going to get a nice sweeter flavor to this and kind of a smoother texture if you go with the pre-roasted sweet potato. So that's just a little bit of a tip that you can work with tonight. Now, the other thing I want to mention, you do not, and I repeat, you do not need to be using a Thermomix. We just are going to need either a blender or a food processor to make sure we can get all those wet ingredients well mixed and well blended before we add the dry ingredients. And then there's going to be this magical bubbly reaction between the apple cider vinegar and the baking soda. So I'm going to show you that one too. So you do not need a Fandangle food processor. This is the main one that I have. So I'm just going to be using this as a food processor today to do all the mixing. And then we're going to mix up the dry ingredients here, combine the two together and get it baking. The other things I'm going to be talking about as we go through this, remind me if I forget, I want to touch base on using sugars and the amount of sugar in baking recipes in particular. And I'm also going to show you how to use this fancy thing, I promise you, for its best advantage. Okay, so I'm going to give you some skills and tricks on that tool right there. This is my favorite tool in the kitchen, I promise you. So if you haven't already done this, let's set that to about 180 degrees. Nothing complicated here, 180 degrees. The only thing I want you to check is that the rack that you're going to be baking the cake on is a little bit below midway point in the oven. So we want the cake to kind of sit, the top of the cake to sort of be in the middle of the oven. That's going to get you the best bake, top and bottom. So just making sure that that rack is a little bit below middle and you'll be set for the baking of this recipe. How are we going so far? And Claire, you're online too. Thank you. Claire's currently doing the program. And all three boys, excellent, in the kitchen with you. All right, well then we better get them busy. So first step, guys, into your food processor. Let's get the wet ingredients and all the other ingredients in the top section of that. So I'm going to show you, I guess, the efficient way to do this so that you have the least amount of dishes or stopping points along the way. So why don't we start out with our 2.5 cups of our roasted sweet potato. So it doesn't matter if this is hot or cold. I just have some leftover sweet potato. This is the red sweet potato. This was a purple sweet potato. So if you haven't seen the different varieties of sweet potato, it's funny because the one with the purple skin has a white interior and the one with the white skin has a purple interior. So they're all just different versions of sweet potato. Some people have a preference for one or the other. I find these white ones quite sweet actually. But their skin's a little bit tougher than the orange one. So not that you should notice it in this recipe, but I'm going to go for about the 2.5 cups of sweet potato here, whichever ones come at me. And we're going to look for about 500 grams. So if you are using a machine or you have access to scales pretty easily, we might as well use them to our best advantage. At least the first time that you do this recipe, or the first time you do any recipe for that matter, when it comes to baking, if you are given weights instead of volumes, I would recommend you use the weights because weight is much more accurate than getting the right amount into a volume cup. Okay, so definitely if you've got access to the weights, we're going to look for about 500 grams. This is probably not quite enough yet. I haven't compacted that down to the 2.5 cups. So we'll just see if we've got about 500 grams there. See, so we're about 100 grams short. Okay, so even if you thought you had about the 2.5 cups, that gives you a second check and measure point. Like I said, I hadn't really squished that down. So we can be, give or take a little bit. Let's call that good. Wow, bang on 500. That never happens. Very cool. Okay, so we've got our sweet potato in there. Now before we do the tahini, notice how the tahini and the rice malt syrup and the coconut sugar and the flax meal are all the 1/2 cup measure. So let's do the dry ingredients before we do the wet ingredients so that we can use the same cup and not have to wash it in between. Now in hindsight, I probably should have listed those in that correct order, and I might do an edit on this recipe so that you don't have to think about that. It's too automatic now for me, so I didn't actually think about that. My apologies. So we want to go for the 1/2 cup of flax meal. Now this is a pretty important ingredient. Now if for some reason you can't do flax meal, okay, then you could probably get away with chia seeds, but you wouldn't use as much. So you'd probably only use about 1/4 cup of chia seeds, maybe 1/3 cup of chia seeds instead of the flax meal. We do want that for its kind of moisture absorbing and binding effect that that's going to have, not to mention the fact that it's a really great source of fiber. So for you boys, Claire's boys, this is going to be your little test at the end. You have to remember what this ingredient is really good for in the body. And if you didn't pick it up just before, maybe Mom can help coach you on that one. I'm going to try to remember to ask you that at the end. So that's our 1/2 cup dry measure of the flax meal. And the second dry ingredient that has the 1/2 cup measure is coconut sugar. Now, on the topic of sugar, while we're here, when it comes to baking, when it comes to whole food baking, technically we want to minimize wherever possible the use of something like this, which is considered a processed sugar. Now, technically speaking, honey and maple syrup are also counted as a processed sugar. However, they have less processing than something like this. And this has much less processing than definitely a white sugar even in some cases the brown sugars as far as the other treatments that they have. Okay, so this is definitely a step better, right? The next best thing that we can do beyond this, actually there's two things. The first thing, so that we can still have our cake and eat it too, is try to adjust your palate for one. So ideally, every time you make something sweet, you're going to be adding less and less sugar to each of the recipes so that your tongue can actually resensitize and learn to appreciate the subtle sweetnesses at the same excitement level of the much greater quantities of sugar you might have been having previously. So the first step is to resensitize the palate. The second step is to try to use more fruit-based or whole food-based sweeteners rather than the processed versions. Okay, so what that would look like in this recipe is trying to use, like I said, the roasted sweet potato. So you're getting enough of the sugars naturally from the sweet potato. You might substitute medjool dates instead of something like the rice bran syrup or the maple syrup, because the medjool dates at least come with a bit more fiber, probably more vitamins and minerals. They're one step better. Okay, so in all cases within a recipe, we want to reduce or minimize the amount of processed ingredients and try to aim to get whole food sources of sweetness, such as dates, such as sultanas. You know, in biscuits you can use sultanas to sweeten it. You can use applesauce in many cases. Okay, so that's kind of the goal when it comes to the sugars, is to at least reduce the total quantity and then improve the quality of the sugars that you are using. Now, on this topic, if this is the first time that you've made this cake, and those of you parents out there that you want to make sure you get immediate approval from the family, the idea there is we probably want to add a little bit more sugar or sweetener than we would normally, or than we would maybe like to, so that we can get the initial buy-in. Because we're changing so many of the other factors for them, let's keep the sweetness a little bit higher so that we get that initial buy-in. And then once we build the trust, once they go and they're not afraid of biting into this cake that looks different to their cake they used to have, then all of a sudden then we can start stepping back the sweetener every time you make it. So it's about baby steps, guys. And definitely this is something you guys will hear me talk a lot about, especially those of you that are doing this 28-day Whole Food Collective Challenge to how to whole food your world. It's definitely about baby steps, and this is how you can start, is just by starting with a higher amount of sugar and stepping it back gradually. Okay, so roughly a half a cup now of the liquid sugar. Now if you're using, it's funny just even saying liquid sugar, but this is a big batch as well. If you're deciding between, say for example, this by the way is an organic rice malt syrup. I just buy it in bulk and stock up a bulk jar. And same with this, I buy this in bulk and restock this, which is why it's so well used. So this is a real Canadian maple, not a maple flavored syrup. You guys are going to be hearing me talk about that in the challenge as well. Very big differences between those two. But between these two, this one's less sweet per volume than a maple syrup. So if you want to reduce the sugar content of the dish, you might want to be using the rice malt syrup instead to have less sweetness. The only difference then that might affect your decision making is that this is much more processed than a maple syrup, as you can probably imagine, because this comes from rice. Doesn't look anything like rice to me. Okay, this comes from rice, and the maple syrup literally pours out of the tray. So there's not a lot of processing to do there. However, the benefit of this, according to the science of today, says that this one could potentially be better simply because it has less fructose quantity in it. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole too deep tonight, other than just saying you have options. And as you make this, the more you make it, the more you can customize. You'll get a feel for kind of the texture that we're after, and you'll get the hang of it. You'll know how much or less sweetener you want to add, what you can get away with the family, and really trying to always push that boundary. Okay? All right. Next wet ingredient for the half cup is our tahini. Now, just quickly on the topic of tahini, I just realized it's not the most pretty jar because I refill this one as well. I buy this by the 2 kilo tub. Again, you can get this at the Whole Food Collective, guys. And then I refill this jar in the fridge. So this is a unhulled tahini. And those of you that are brand new to tahini, you may want to stick with the hulled, just because it's going to have less less of a strong flavor. Okay, you probably won't pick up on it within this dish, but it is much stronger in flavor. The reason why I choose this one is, well, because I do love the flavor now, but also because with that added flavor comes extra nutrition. Okay, it's less processed than the hulled variety of tahini. So there's more nutrition in this. Tahini, really try to get that in your life. It's so high in calcium, guys. Like it's higher than milk in terms of a serving. It's higher than milk. So, you know, if that's why you're still having milk, or that's why you think you need to have milk, you have an option, you have an alternative. And tahini is so versatile. It can be used in a bazillion different ways. Not going to cover that now. Focus on cake, Ashley. How's everyone going? Christy, hello, welcome. Thank you for being online as well. Maybe your little ones are in the kitchen too, mingling around. Okay, so next up, we're going to need, we're up to the water. So without losing my place, about 3/4 of a cup of water, preferably filtered water. If you guys have access to that, that would be great. Okay, let's check my measurements there on the horizontal, looks good. And then about 1/3 of a cup of our apple cider vinegar, okay? Now you might be going, oh my gosh, 1/3 of a cup of apple cider vinegar, is that a typo? No, it's not, and the reason is we want fluffy cake. So we want this to have the reaction with the baking soda when we put that in to give us the bubbles that we're after. Okay, so 1/3 of a cup of our apple cider vinegar. Okay, that can go straight in. There we go. And then our spices, and we're pretty much ready to turn this into a really kind of thick smoothie type thing before we add the dry ingredients. So let's do about 1/2 teaspoon or so of salt. If you want to change this flavor up in the future, you could go for more of like a salted caramel or a salted choc chip kind of brownie, and you just put in an extra 1/2 teaspoon should be sufficient for that. You could change up the spices if you wished. So instead of doing vanilla and cinnamon, you might try to do more of like a chai flavored chocolate cake, which would need, you know, some ginger, some cloves, maybe a little bit of extra cinnamon in that case. So you can get a bit flexible with this. This cake doesn't end up tasting like cinnamon, so don't worry about that. It just kind of gives it an extra profile. It's an extra bit of balance to the flavor. Okay, so we've got our teaspoons of that, and I believe that's all those ingredients for now. So let's get that blended up. Let's get it well mixed. We're gonna just crank your machine on high. It doesn't really matter how high or for how long. We just wanna make sure that we're getting a full, nice, even blend on this. All right, that sounds about right. So we want the smoothest smoothie that you can get here for obviously the smoothest brownie. Okay, so that's kind of the texture that we're looking for. Doesn't look pretty, I know, but you know, chocolate cake doesn't really have the brightest rainbow colors either, and we haven't put the actual chocolate color in yet, which is the cacao. So we'll get to that. Okay, so it's nice and smooth. That's what we're after. We don't want, like, I mean, there's not too many lumpy, bumpy bits. That's nice and smooth. Okay, that's what we're going for. Lots of smooth sweet potato. The advantage to this recipe, if you guys haven't already kind of realized what types of ingredients I've got here, obviously it's gluten-free. It's also grain-free. So those of you that are following a paleo diet, this is definitely suitable for that. It's egg-free, so it can go to schools. I heard so many schools nowadays are just really picky about no nuts, no eggs. So this satisfies that as well, guys. I've even heard some parents get in trouble for sending anything that's chocolatey, but maybe you can speak to the teacher and say that this is an extremely whole food, healthy-based dish. You've reduced the sugar, etc., etc. I promise you it's going to be better than so many of the other muesli bars or things that kids get sent with in many cases nowadays. So Homemade is usually best. You have control over not only the quality of the ingredients, but what kinds of ingredients you're putting in. Okay, dry ingredients up next. So we're gonna do some coconut flour, about 2/3 of a cup. Now again, if we had been super organized, we could have done this measurement first in the dry cup, but that's all right, we just had vinegar in it, so we'll do that easy. Hello to Kareen and Steph, welcome guys, thank you. Carl, welcome, and Johnny, thanks for being online. Okay, so 2/3 of a cup. Now I'm doing the naughty here, as in I'm sticking the, what's this called? A measuring cup into the jar and moving it around to get my measurement. The reason why this is called, I guess, the naughty is because I'm going to be getting more weight into this cup as a result of kind of smushing it and compacting it in the jar than if I had scooped it into the cup. So that's a little bit of an FYI. You could, in this case, then check your weight measurement, okay? Or you could just maybe slightly underdo it if you know it's fairly compacted. At the end of the day, it's not gonna make a huge difference in this recipe because there's so much moisture in this cake already, okay? So about 2/3 of a cup of our coconut sugar, and then we need the 1 cup of the cacao powder. Now, hopefully I have enough here. So I'm going in with the 1/4 cup, and we're gonna do 4 of these. Now, the other customization you can do for this recipe is if you want a bit of extra sweetness and you want to reduce the processed sugars, substitute half of this for carob powder instead. Carob powder is so much sweeter than cacao. Okay, it's actually surprisingly sweet. So you could probably halve the other sugars in this recipe if you put in half a cup of carob powder. It's also a very wonderful superfood. So it's got a bunch of other kind of mineral and vitamin benefits in addition to cacao. It has a slightly different flavor though, so maybe start out with only, say, 1/4 of a cup of carob if you're new to it, and then you could work your way up if you like it. That was lucky. Need to order some more cacao powder from the Whole Food Collective. Lainey, can you get me onto that, please? And then last but not least, our baking soda. So 1.5 teaspoons of the baking soda. Now try to get pretty exact with this one. Okay, because 2 things. 1, if we have too much baking soda and not enough vinegar, you're going to taste baking soda. If you have not enough baking soda, too much vinegar, you might taste a bit of acidity in the recipe. So this is the perfect balance that we've kind of established within this cake to have the, I guess, the full reaction to give you bubbles without any residual vinegar taste or baking soda taste. So if ever you're making a recipe and you can taste baking soda, it's because you haven't got enough reagent or enough acid basically in the dish. The next thing I want to show you to save us another step here, normally baking soda comes with lumps. So I normally put it into my fingers first and then squish out any of the lumps so that we don't end up with a nice big chunk of soapy tasting something in our cake. Okay, so I'm using the 1/2 teaspoon, so I'm going to need 3 of these. Into the fingers, squish out the lumps, and then you don't have to worry about mixing it super finely before we put it in the machine. Okay, because from this point, we don't want to overmix the wet with the dry. That's why we really well mix the wet first and we well mix the dry first so that we don't overdo it when we put the 2 together, because that's just going to pound out all of our bubbles. It's going to get rid of all those bubbles. So I'm just going to give this a fairly decent combination first. And again, depending on what machine you're using, this is not super critical. Sometimes it's enough to just suck it into the machine by blending it, but we'll try to get a mixture there if we can. Okay. So now, those of you doing this in a non-Thermomix machine, as in a regular food processor, you may wish to do the rest of this now in a bowl. So mixing it by hand might be a little bit more easier, a bit more reliable, only because this is going to thicken up really quickly. So if your machine doesn't have a wand to help it mix while it's doing that, it might be easier in a bowl. Okay, so you have that option now. You could take everything out of that, mix it up into a nice big humongous bowl, and then you've got that option. Those of you that are, I guess, cooking with something that you can kind of mix and help it along with, I'm going to show you this method now. Okay, and this is part of what I mean by using the right tool for the job. So if you get yourself a good food processor, it doesn't have to be this kind, but a good one that's fairly strong, powerful, then you'll have more enjoyment in the kitchen because you'll need to do less dishes, less smucking around, basically. Okay, so this is the last step. So we only want to mix just until everything's combined. Otherwise, we're going to be getting rid of those precious bubbles. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it up to probably about 7 in this case, and I'm going to help it mix straight away. Those of you that are mixing it in the bowl, just mix as quickly as you can without spilling it everywhere, and you'll start to see those bubbles start to join up. All right, so that was maybe 6 or 7 seconds, okay? And you can see this nice, I guess, fluffy batter that we're gonna have here. Now, I guess I could have reminded you to get out your equipment or your baking tray that you're gonna be using before we did this. I already had mine out, so I didn't think of it, forgive me. But we wanna be transferring this fairly quickly into its baking dishes. If you haven't got one that's big enough altogether, you can do 2. I like doing 2 because then one is already ready to go for the freezer, and it doesn't need to be cut up. So if you need to take it to someone's house because you've been invited for dinner, then it doesn't look like you've already eaten half of it. So I like having 2 dishes sometimes. It's a bit of a cheat. And the reason why I do this, and the reason why I make my recipes a little bit bigger than most recipes, is because if you're going to go to the effort to make this, you might as well get a big batch out of it if it freezes well. That's my theory anyways, for efficiency. Okay, how's everyone going? Good? All right, so let's get this into the pans, okay? And then I'm going to show you how to make use of this spatula for its full advantage so that you don't leave a single piece of cake in the dish uncooked, okay? The number of times that I see this happen. So there's a little bit that you can see is not perfectly mixed. So ideally, we just want to give it a good little stir as we're putting it into the dish, so that we kind of blend those last little bits in, but it's pretty good, okay? The least mixing we do, basically the fluffier the cake's gonna be. So let's get that into the dish. It's quite thick, that's all right. It's full of, because we have so much wonderful fiber in this dish, that's gonna keep this moist. So those of you that have ever suffered from the gluten-free rock syndrome, as in if you're cooking a gluten-free recipe and it just turns quite hard as a result of, you know, not having enough fiber or moisture in the dish, then that can be part of it. So having this sweet potato as one of our main ingredients is going to help and keep this nice and moist even the next couple of days after cooking it. So that's okay that this is this texture. This is perfectly what we want, and it's going to help to keep it nice and fluffy when we bake it. Okay, so it doesn't have to be perfectly smoothed down. If you do want it to be much smoother on top, then I would recommend getting a soup spoon, something like that, and just oiling the back of it. So we already had some oil in that dish. You can just oil the back of it. You might need to do this a few times until the tops of the cake is sorted, but you can just oil the backs of that and get in there with a spoon. Okay, so that's roughly the amount for this dish, and then we'll go to this smaller dish. Okay, now again, the surface does not have to be perfect. It's kind of nice to be a little bit rough hewn on the top, and I'll show you what we're going to do that one after. Glenda, what have I prepared the dish with? Good question. Okay, so it's just a little bit of oil. I just chose whatever I could grab out of the cupboard. It's macadamia oil that I chose, but any oil that you've got, hopefully, well, I know that you, Glenda, are going to be using good oils, so that's good. Just a little bit of that. It doesn't actually need it 100%. It'll still come out of the dish quite well. I just maybe put it down by a bit of a habit. Okay, so let's talk about how you're going to use your spatula to make sure you don't leave anything behind. So whenever you're going to be using a machine that has the blades down the bottom, so namely a blender or a food processor, it will be good for you to know how to use this spatula so that you don't leave anything behind and you don't waste. So what I'm going to show you is, I guess, some tips for this. So, excuse me, see how much is still in there? I kind of did a little step too quickly there and forgot to show you before I got to this stage. But usually, and I kid you not, people will throw away that equivalent of batter inside the bottom of their dish. But if you're going to use a good quality spatula, then this is how you get in. So the idea is first of all, we want to go down the sides. Okay, so I'll try to show you this in motion here. So let's try to clear our spatula as best we can first. Okay, it's okay if it's a bit messy. So we're going to go down the sides all the way around. And that's going to make sure you get everything concentrated down the bottom. All right. Then in this case, we're going to try to take it off the tops of the blades. So just run the spatula over the tops of the blades. Okay. Now the next trick is about trying to get the spatula to bend underneath the blades a little bit. So this might be a little bit hard to see exactly in detail, but I'm going to put it down the bottom, and then I'm going to put enough pressure on it that just the tip of the spatula bends a little bit flat down the bottom. Okay. Now here's the trick. Keep it bent, so I'm putting a fair bit of pressure on that, and you go around until you can scrape most of what's underneath that blade out from under it. Okay, and look how much, that's like a whole extra piece of cake that we just got out of there. Okay, so we're going to put that in and we're going to go again. So a little bit of scraping off the blades, getting a little bit more out every time, pushing it to the edges. And in this case, I can see that there's batter hiding under the blades and right around the center of the spin. Okay, so the same thing goes. I'm going to try to bend the tip of the spatula into that center bit and go around with the blade. So I'm pushing against the center now of the blade. Okay, and then we're going to go around the edge of the dish now that we've moved it around the edge to get more out still. Okay, so there's another half a piece of cake still, and we thought we were done after the first piece of cake. Okay, so we get that all out. And why not, we'll go back one more time, polish it clean. If you want, and you're really pedantic about waste, not like me at all, you might even run, this is careful, adults only guys, you might carefully run your finger under the back of the blade, not the sharp side, the back of the blade, just to get that extra little bit out. Save yourself the cost, save the environment, save the needless waste, and make best use of the tools that you've got. So there we go. Now if anyone asks to lick the bowl clean, you can say, yes, doesn't really matter. Go ahead, there's nothing in there. And then the next trick is, I guess you could say, the God-given spatulas that we have, 5-10 of them actually, but 2 of them work best. So let's use them to their fullest advantage too, and make sure we get all of that extra little bit of cake into there. So that's a bit of a long drawn out explanation, but I really want you guys to learn how to use the tools that you've got for the best of your advantage so that you're not wasting food. And you might sit there and think, oh, that's what, 20 cents worth of batter? So what? It adds up. This batter, that batter, the next day, that day's efforts, it all adds up, guys. And it's more so just because it's not necessary. If you have the skills, you've got the tool that doesn't cost much, you might as well make use of it. Okay, so I maybe misjudged the amounts in this. I could have added a little bit more into this dish, but that's all right. I'll just get a slightly thinner brownie. And then the last step here is going to be to put a little bit of coconut cream on top. Now you might be wondering why we're doing that. So I will explain. Is everyone with me so far? I know it's a little bit finicky when you're getting it kind of flattened into the dish, but you'll get the hang of it. And if you do it all in one big dish, it's a lot easier than the 2. I just wanted the advantage of being able to freeze one or give one away. Maybe I should do a giveaway online, ship it to you guys. Oh boy. All right, next step is the coconut cream. So the reason for the coconut cream on top is just so that we don't get a really crusty, dry top on the brownie. Okay, so look, I forgot some. Just kidding. So the reason why we're going to do this coconut cream is to just keep them a little bit more moist. Okay, this is just a bit of a trick of the trade. So about 1/4 of a cup, maybe 1/3 of a cup of coconut cream on top. You don't necessarily have to measure it, but if it's your first time, go ahead. We don't necessarily want to cover the whole cake. We just want to put a little drizzle of it on there. As it bakes, it's going to naturally kind of soak in around, and that's kind of what we're after, just to keep that top a little bit more moist and add a bit of nice richness to the top. Okay, you won't be able to tell you've done this once you've baked it. It's just a bit more extra moisture. All right, that's it, guys. That's our chocolate sweet potato cake. And now we just have to put it in the oven to bake. And once it's done baking, it's sort of 30 minutes in the oven. Then we're going to try, if possible, to let it sit in the oven with the door ajar so it can kind of cool slowly in the oven, and maybe do a little bit more drying out. It's funny that I'm saying drying out more for a gluten-free recipe, but I promise you this one is full of moisture and beautiful deliciousness. It's smooth and it's moist. So let's get that straight into the oven, and then we'll pretend as if a magic 30 minutes has gone by really quickly. Okay, into the oven, into the center if you can. And it might be worth you getting a hold of a secondary oven thermometer so that you can double check that the temperature actually is what it says it is, because I find many ovens are not what they say they are. Right, so we'll check that one's on par. Yep, it's maybe a little bit cool, so we can turn that up a little bit. Okay, now, ta-da, 30 minutes is gone, taking out of the oven, the done cake. And as you'll see here, there are some big mice in my kitchen. See that mouse? It's a really very geometrical, skilled mouse. It knows how to take a perfect square out of the dish. But I guess that, you know, it's pretty hard to control mice in houses, right? So we'll just we'll let that be. And we know that we've had quality control, and it's all good, I guess. So there's our pre-done brownie. As you can see, you can't really tell that there's been the coconut cream on top. It does have a bit of a crust. This has now cooled. And the reason I wanted to show you this step is because when you first take the brownie out of the oven, brownie or cake, I sort of use those words interchangeably, sorry. When you take it out of the oven, it will be quite crumbly. Okay, so just that's FYI. Some people actually really like that, and you can use that to your advantage. So you may have seen in the notes that I recommend, if you want to kind of have it like a warm sort of sticky date pudding kind of texture, then have it straight out of the oven, have it with a bit of hopefully coconut ice cream and maybe some fresh berries or frozen defrosted berries, as I'm going to do tonight. But you have options. You can have it nice, moist, kind of gooey. It's not actually gooey, it's fully cooked, and it doesn't have that kind of sticky texture. It's more just really nice and moist. So hopefully you'll kind of understand what I mean once you've done this. It's not as much of a brownie as, it's more of a cake than a brownie, okay? So without doing anything too crazy creative, I'm just gonna follow the mouse's suit and get a couple of pieces into here. And then, you know, I might not officially call this my dinner, but maybe unofficially so. So I'm going to break this apart so you can kind of see the texture. So it's definitely not brownie-like. It's quite cakey. It's quite fluffy. I don't know if you can see all the texture and detail in there, but it's still quite light, and hopefully you find that nice and fluffy. You could turn this into a birthday cake quite easily, just doing the different shapes. Just try to make sure that you still achieve that thickness overall, and then you'll get the full kind of cooking through of the cake. And then you can decorate hopefully with whole food ingredients. So I'm going to pull out my yummy coconut ice cream. And why don't we have a little try with some berries. Oh, that's like the perfect smoothness. Oh my gosh, it's like I planned it. Wow. Maybe I did. There we go. Oh, I don't know about you guys, but it's kind of, I guess, I'm just going to say it's my birthday today. It's not, but I'm going to have dessert for dinner. Is that all right? Who else is having dessert for dinner tonight? Oh my gosh, look at that. Should we put the strawberry on top? Kind of on top? Excited? Are you guys excited? I'm excited. Giving one away is such a sweet idea, a friendship brownie. Yes, Steph, great idea. Friendship brownies. We should start friendship brownie giving. I like that. It's awesome. And welcome, Kelly. Thanks for being on tonight, too. Okay, guys. Oh, my strawberry fell. What do you think? Let me know when you get a chance to make this, what you think. I want to hear your feedback. I'm sure Jasmine would love to hear your feedback. And I want to hear your feedback, Jasmine. Other than that, enjoy your sweet potato cake, chocolate cake a la different style. Hopefully you'll feel the goodness in your body and maybe feel a little bit less guilty every time you go for a slice. But I would still highly recommend keeping it in the freezer, so it's not quite as easy to just go and polish off the whole thing, especially if you have mice in your house. Enjoy, guys. Thank you so much for being on Cook With Me Live. If it is your first time, would love to see you again and also have your feedback and your thoughts on any other recipes that you're wanting me to show you how to do. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time. Night-night.